A Harlem charity collected $3,000 to help struggling families through the winter. By morning, every dollar had vanished. The community knew who took it. They also knew who would get it back. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, hit subscribe, because this story proves that some debts get paid in full. The basement of Mount Olivet Baptist Church on West 120th Street served as headquarters for the Harlem Community Relief Fund every November. In 1963, the fund represented something larger than charity. It meant neighbors helping neighbors when the city government wouldn't. Families contributed what they could. Local businesses donated. By the third week of November, the collection had reached $3,000, enough to help 40 families buy food and coal for the coming months. Reverend James Holloway kept the money in a locked metal box inside his office. He counted it every evening before going home. On November 22nd, he counted $3,000. On the morning of November 23rd, he unlocked his office and found the window broken and the box empty. The police came. They took notes. They asked questions. Then they left with promises that felt hollow to everyone who heard them. Harlem residents had learned not to expect much when crimes happened in their neighborhood. The detectives who showed up seemed more interested in finishing their paperwork than finding stolen charity money. But the community had its own methods of gathering information. By noon, 3 different people had told Reverend Holloway the same name: Tony Delucci, a small-time operator who ran card games and loan shark operations on the edges of Harlem. He employed local men as collectors and used a social club on 118th Street as his base. People knew him. Some owed him money. Nobody particularly liked him, but he had connections that made him untouchable to most residents. Tony had been seen near the church the previous afternoon. He had asked questions about the relief fund. He had made comments about how much money was being collected. 2 witnesses saw him walking past the church around midnight. The evidence was circumstantial, but convincing to anyone who understood how the neighborhood worked. Reverend Holloway faced a decision. He could wait for the police investigation that would likely go nowhere. He could accept the loss and try to collect the money again, or he could do what several community members were quietly suggesting. He could talk to Bumpy Johnson. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson operated according to different rules than Tony Delucci. Bumpy controlled significant portions of Harlem's underground economy, but he maintained strict principles about how business was conducted. He didn't steal from churches. He didn't rob charities. He didn't take from people who had nothing. These weren't just personal ethics. They were business strategy. Bumpy's power in Harlem depended on community respect, and that respect required boundaries that men like Tony Delucci apparently didn't understand. The Reverend had never spoken directly to Bumpy Johnson before. He knew of him, as everyone in Harlem did. He had seen him at community events, always well-dressed, always surrounded by associates, always maintaining a certain distance from the church world. But circumstances had changed. The stolen money wasn't just currency. It represented trust within a community that had little reason to trust anyone. That afternoon, Reverend Holloway walked to the Rhythm Club on Lenox Avenue. He asked to speak with Bumpy Johnson. He waited. 20 minutes later, he was escorted to a back room where Bumpy sat at a table with 2 associates. The Reverend explained what had happened. He didn't ask for help directly. He simply laid out the facts and let them speak for themselves. Bumpy listened without interrupting. When the Reverend finished, Bumpy asked 3 questions. How much was taken? When exactly did it happen? Who did the Reverend think was responsible? The Reverend answered each question. Then, Bumpy nodded and said the Reverend would hear from him soon. Word travels fast in any tight community. By evening, people throughout Harlem knew that Bumpy Johnson was aware of the charity robbery. The knowledge changed the atmosphere on the streets. Tony Delucci had made a miscalculation. He had stolen from the community in a way that couldn't be ignored. He had created a problem that the official authorities wouldn't solve, and he had done it in territory where unofficial authorities operated with more efficiency than any police precinct. Tony Delucci heard the rumors too. He understood what they meant. He had worked in Harlem long enough to know the power structure, but Tony had convinced himself that the rules didn't fully apply to him. He had Italian connections in East Harlem. He had relationships with police officers who looked the other way. He had operated for 3 years without serious interference. The charity money had seemed like an easy target, and $3,000 represented a significant score for a small-time operator. What Tony failed to understand was the difference between being tolerated and being protected. Bumpy tolerated various small operators as long as they followed certain guidelines. Robbing a church charity violated those guidelines completely. Tony had crossed from the category of minor nuisance into the category of problem that needed solving. The money itself wasn't the main issue. The principle was, if one operator could rob a charity without consequences, others would follow. The system that Bumpy had carefully constructed would collapse. That night, while Tony Delucci counted his stolen money and planned how to spend it, Bumpy Johnson was making different plans. Plans that would recover the $3,000 and deliver a message that would resonate throughout Harlem for years to come. The robbery had taken minutes. The response would take longer, but it would be thorough. Tony Delucci had arrived in Harlem in 1960 with ambitions that exceeded his capabilities. He came from a minor crime family in East Harlem that had given him just enough backing to start operations, but not enough protection to shield him from consequences. His social club on 118th Street operated as a front for his real business, high-interest loans to desperate people and card games with rigged odds. The men who worked for Tony collected debts with threats and occasional violence. They targeted people who had nowhere else to turn. A mother behind on rent, a father who needed medicine for a sick child, a shop owner struggling to keep his business open. Tony offered quick money at rates that guaranteed most borrowers would never fully repay. When they couldn't pay, Tony took whatever they had: furniture, jewelry, sometimes the businesses themselves. His operation stayed small by design. Tony understood that Harlem belonged to other powers, primarily Bumpy Johnson and his network. So Tony positioned himself as a minor player who didn't threaten the existing order. He paid tribute when required. He stayed away from the most profitable territories. He kept his operation just visible enough to attract customers, but not so visible that it demanded attention from those above him. This strategy had worked for 3 years. Tony had built a modest income. He had avoided serious conflicts. He had convinced himself that he understood how to navigate Harlem's criminal landscape. The charity robbery revealed how wrong he was. Tony had watched the relief fund collection grow throughout November. He had seen the steady stream of donations. He had calculated the total and decided that $3,000 represented an opportunity too good to ignore. The church had minimal security. The Reverend kept predictable hours. The money sat in a simple, locked box. Tony had executed similar jobs before without consequences. What Tony miscalculated was the symbolic importance of that particular $3,000. In his thinking, money was money regardless of its source. A dollar stolen from a charity spent the same as a dollar earned from a card game. He failed to understand that in a community like Harlem in 1963, where resources were scarce and outside help was unreliable, a charity fund represented something beyond its monetary value. It represented collective hope and mutual support. Stealing it wasn't just theft. It was betrayal. Bumpy Johnson had built his position through a different understanding of community dynamics. Born in South Carolina in 1905, Bumpy had arrived in Harlem as a teenager. He had worked his way up through the criminal hierarchy during Prohibition, learning from established operators and adapting to changing circumstances. By 1963, he controlled numbers rackets, gambling operations, and protection services across significant portions of Harlem. But Bumpy's power rested on more than muscle and money. He had cultivated a reputation as someone who operated according to consistent principles. He settled disputes fairly. He kept violence targeted and minimal. He provided employment to men who had few other options. He contributed to community causes and showed respect to churches and legitimate businesses. These weren't acts of charity. They were investments in the social capital that allowed his operations to function without constant resistance. Bumpy had survived decades in a dangerous business because he understood context. He knew when to push and when to compromise. He knew which battles mattered and which ones didn't. He knew that power in Harlem required more than force. It required community acceptance, or at least community tolerance. The charity robbery threatened that carefully maintained balance. If word spread that someone could rob a church fund in Bumpy's territory without facing consequences, his authority would erode. Other operators would test boundaries. Community members would question whether Bumpy still controlled the situation. The police might use the incident as justification for increased pressure. A $3,000 theft could cascade into problems worth far more than the money itself. Bumpy also operated under constraints that Tony Delucci either didn't know about or didn't care about. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum. Harlem was changing. Outside attention was increasing. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had been targeting black organized crime figures for years. Bumpy had already served prison time and knew that every action carried risks. He couldn't respond to the charity robbery with excessive violence or public spectacle. He needed a solution that recovered the money, punished the thief, and sent a message, all while maintaining the appearance of order. So Bumpy approached the problem methodically. He assigned associates to track Tony's movements. He gathered information about where Tony kept his money and who he trusted. He identified Tony's routines and vulnerabilities. He planned an intervention that would be decisive but controlled. Tony Delucci, meanwhile, had taken the $3,000 and hidden it in his apartment above the social club. He had told only 2 of his closest associates about the robbery. He planned to wait a few weeks before spending the money, letting the immediate attention fade. He believed that if he stayed quiet and acted normal, the incident would pass without serious consequences. He was wrong. By the time Tony heard that Bumpy Johnson was personally involved, the plan to recover the money and destroy Tony's reputation was already in motion. The only question was when and where Bumpy would make his move. Bumpy Johnson didn't rush. Rushing created mistakes, and mistakes in his line of work meant prison or death. He had learned patience during his years in the business, and he applied that patience to the Tony Delucci situation. The charity money would be recovered. Tony would be dealt with. But it would happen on Bumpy's timeline, not Tony's, and certainly not on the timeline the community expected. The first step was intelligence gathering. Bumpy assigned 2 of his most reliable associates to watch Tony's movements. They tracked him for 3 days, noting everywhere he went and everyone he spoke with. They identified his patterns. Tony left his apartment above the social club every morning at 9. He walked to a diner on Lenox Avenue for breakfast. He returned to the club by 10 and stayed there until evening. He ate dinner at various restaurants, never the same place 2 nights in a row. He returned to his apartment between 9 and 10 at night. Tony varied his routes but not his destinations. He tried to appear cautious while maintaining his normal routine. This gave Bumpy's men exactly what they needed: predictability masked as unpredictability. Tony thought he was being careful. He was actually making himself easier to track. The second step was identifying where Tony had hidden the money. Bumpy's associates couldn't search Tony's apartment without alerting him, so they used other methods. They talked to the building superintendent, a man who owed Bumpy a favor. They learned that Tony had been in his apartment for several hours the night of the robbery and hadn't left with any packages or bags. They confirmed that Tony hadn't visited a bank or safety deposit box in the days since. The money was almost certainly still in the apartment. The third step was understanding Tony's support network. Tony employed 4 men as regular collectors. 2 of them were loyal. 2 of them were opportunists who worked for Tony because he paid them, not because they respected him. Bumpy had one of his associates approach the 2 opportunists separately. The conversation was brief and simple. If Tony had problems, would they stand with him or step aside? Both men chose to step aside. When the time came, Tony would have no backup. Bumpy also reached out to Tony's supposed connections in East Harlem. He made discreet inquiries through intermediaries. The responses confirmed what Bumpy suspected. Tony's Italian connections were minimal. The family he claimed to represent barely acknowledged him. He had been useful for small operations that they didn't want to handle directly, but they had no investment in protecting him. If Tony got into trouble in Harlem, he was on his own. This information shaped Bumpy's approach. He didn't need to worry about starting a larger conflict. He didn't need to negotiate with outside powers. Tony was isolated, and Tony didn't know he was isolated. That ignorance would be useful. The fourth step was choosing the right moment and method. Bumpy considered several options. He could have Tony grabbed off the street and brought to a private location. He could have men break into Tony's apartment while he slept. He could arrange a meeting under false pretenses. Each option had advantages and risks. Bumpy chose a different approach. He decided to confront Tony publicly but in a controlled environment. Public enough to send a message to the community. Controlled enough to avoid attention from police or outsiders who might complicate the situation. The location would be Tony's own social club. The timing would be during evening hours when the club had customers, but before it got crowded enough to create chaos. The plan required Tony to be at the club, which his pattern suggested he would be. It required his loyal collectors to be elsewhere, which could be arranged through misdirection. It required the customers present to understand what was happening without interfering, which Bumpy's reputation would ensure. And it required recovering the money from Tony's apartment, which meant Tony needed to provide access either voluntarily or involuntarily. Bumpy met with 3 of his most trusted associates to explain the plan. He would enter the club with 2 men. They would identify themselves clearly. They would give Tony one opportunity to return the money without additional consequences. If Tony refused or couldn't produce the money immediately, they would escort him to his apartment to retrieve it. The confrontation would be firm, but not violent unless Tony made it violent. The goal was recovery and humiliation, not bloodshed. One of Bumpy's associates asked what would happen if Tony tried to fight or run. Bumpy's answer was simple. Tony wouldn't fight because he wasn't brave enough. Tony wouldn't run because he had nowhere to go. Tony would calculate his options and realize he had none. Then he would cooperate. Men like Tony always cooperated when they understood their situation clearly. The date was set for November 26th, 3 days after the robbery, long enough for Tony to think he might get away with it, short enough that the community still remembered and cared. Bumpy sent word to Reverend Holloway that the matter would be resolved soon. He didn't provide details. He simply asked the Reverend to trust the process. On the evening of November 26th, Bumpy Johnson put on his best suit, the charcoal gray one he wore for important business. He checked his appearance in the mirror. He placed a small revolver in his jacket pocket, not because he expected to use it, but because going unarmed was foolish. Then, he walked out into the Harlem night with 2 associates following close behind. Tony Delucci's time had come. The social club on 118th Street had 12 customers when Bumpy Johnson walked through the door at 7:30. Most of them were regulars who came for the card games and cheap drinks. A few were there to place bets or discuss business with Tony's collectors. The conversation stopped the moment Bumpy entered. Everyone in that room knew who he was. Everyone understood what his presence meant. Tony Delucci sat at his usual table in the back corner, playing cards with 3 men. He had a stack of chips in front of him and a glass of whiskey at his elbow. He looked up when the room went quiet. His face showed recognition, then calculation, then forced calm. He set his cards down slowly and stood up. Bumpy walked directly to Tony's table. His 2 associates positioned themselves near the door, blocking the exit without appearing threatening. Bumpy stopped 3 feet from Tony. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The entire room was listening. "Tony Delucci," Bumpy said, "we need to talk about some money that doesn't belong to you." Tony's 3 card partners pushed back from the table and moved away quickly. They wanted no part of what was about to happen. Tony remained standing, trying to maintain composure. He spread his hands in a gesture meant to appear innocent. "I don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Johnson. If somebody owes you money, I can check my records, but I run a clean operation here." Bumpy's expression didn't change. $3,000. Taken from Mount Olivet Baptist Church, the Community Relief Fund. You broke into Reverend Holloway's office on November 22nd. You took money that was meant to help families through the winter. I'm here to get it back. The room was completely silent now. Customers had stopped pretending to mind their own business. This was the kind of moment people would talk about for years. Tony Delucci being confronted by Bumpy Johnson over stolen charity money. The story was already writing itself in the minds of everyone present. Tony shook his head. That's a serious accusation. You got any proof? Because I've been here every night. My people can vouch for me. I didn't rob any church. Bumpy took one step closer. I'm not a police detective, Tony. I don't need proof that would hold up in court. I need the truth, and I already have it. You were seen near the church. You asked questions about the collection. You disappeared for 2 hours on the night of the robbery. The money is in your apartment upstairs. We both know it. Everyone in this room knows it. So let's stop wasting time. Tony's face reddened. He glanced toward the door where Bumpy's associates stood. He looked at the customers watching from other tables. He was calculating whether he could bluff his way through this or whether he needed a different strategy. Bumpy could see the thoughts moving across Tony's face. Even if what you're saying was true, and I'm not saying it is, what gives you the right to walk into my place and make demands? I have connections too. I have people who would be very interested in hearing about this conversation. It was a weak play, and everyone knew it. Bumpy had anticipated this exact response. Your connections in East Harlem don't care about you, Tony. I already checked. You're on your own. Your collectors who are supposed to be here tonight? They're not coming. It's just you and me and these witnesses. Now you have 2 choices. You can take me upstairs right now and give me the $3,000. You keep breathing, keep your club, keep operating, and we forget this happened. Or you can keep lying, and I'll take the money anyway. But you won't like how that goes. Tony's hands clenched into fists. For a moment, it looked like he might try something stupid. Bumpy remained perfectly still, hands relaxed at his sides. One of his associates shifted slightly near the door. The movement was subtle but clear. If Tony started something, it would end badly for him. Tony unclenched his fists. The fight went out of his posture. He was a small-time operator facing someone who operated on a completely different level, and he knew it. His bluff had been called. His connections were worthless. His reputation in this room was already destroyed just by having this conversation in front of customers. He had nothing left to negotiate with. The money's upstairs, Tony said quietly. In my apartment. Bumpy nodded. Then let's go get it. Nice and easy. They walked through the club toward the back stairs that led to Tony's apartment. Every eye in the room followed them. Bumpy gestured for one of his associates to come along. The other stayed by the door to make sure none of the customers left to spread the word before this was finished. Not that it would matter. The story was already locked in. Tony Delucci had been confronted, had tried to deny everything, and had folded completely when pressed. The apartment above the club was small and cheaply furnished. Tony lived alone, which was fortunate, because it meant no complications. He walked directly to his bedroom without being told. Bumpy and his associate followed. Tony opened his closet and pulled out a shoebox from the top shelf. Inside the shoebox was the metal lockbox from Reverend Holloway's office, still locked. You didn't even bother to break it open? Bumpy asked. Tony shrugged. I was going to wait a few weeks. Didn't want to spend the money too fast and draw attention. Where's the key? Don't have it. I was going to pry it open when I was ready. Bumpy took the lockbox. It was heavy. The weight felt right for $3,000 in mixed bills. He would verify the amount before returning it to the Reverend, but he was confident it was all there. Tony had been greedy, but not greedy enough to spend the money before getting caught. We're going back downstairs now, Bumpy said. You're going to stand in front of your customers and tell them exactly what you did. You're going to admit you robbed the church charity. You're going to apologize. Then I'm leaving with this money, and you're going to think very carefully about the choices that brought you to this moment. Tony's face went pale. You're taking the money back. That's enough. Don't make me humiliate myself in front of my customers. I still have to run a business here. Bumpy shook his head. That's not how this works. You didn't just steal money, Tony. You stole from people who have nothing. You took from a charity that was helping families survive. That requires more than just returning what you took. It requires acknowledging what you did. Everyone in Harlem needs to know that this kind of thing has consequences. You're going to be the example. They went back downstairs. The customers hadn't moved. They sat or stood exactly where they had been, waiting to see how this ended. Bumpy positioned Tony in the center of the room. He stood next to him, holding the lockbox. Tell them, Bumpy said. Tony looked at the floor. Then he looked at the faces watching him. Then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I robbed the church charity. I took the $3,000 from Reverend Holloway's office. I'm sorry." Bumpy let the words hang in the air for a long moment. Then he turned and walked toward the door. His associates followed. Nobody in the room said a word. Tony Delucci stood alone in the center of his own social club, thoroughly defeated in front of everyone who mattered in his small world. The money was recovered. The message was delivered. The night's work was done. Bumpy Johnson delivered the lockbox to Reverend Holloway the next morning. The Reverend opened it in Bumpy's presence and counted the money. $3,000, exact to the penny. Nothing missing. He looked up at Bumpy with an expression that mixed gratitude with something more complicated. Relief, certainly, but also the uncomfortable acknowledgement of how the money had been recovered and what that said about how power actually worked in their neighborhood. "Thank you," the Reverend said. "The families who need this will never know how close they came to losing it." Bumpy nodded. "They don't need to know the details. They just need the help. You can tell people the money was recovered. That's enough." But of course, the details spread anyway. By that afternoon, everyone in Harlem knew what had happened at Tony Delucci's social club. The story traveled through barbershops and beauty parlors, through street corners and stoops, through churches and bars. With each retelling, the details became sharper. How Bumpy had walked in calmly, how Tony had tried to deny everything, how he had been forced to confess in front of his own customers, how he had been humiliated without a single punch being thrown. The story served multiple purposes. It confirmed Bumpy's position as someone who enforced community standards. It demonstrated that certain boundaries could not be crossed without consequences. It showed that the unofficial power structure in Harlem operated more reliably than the official one. The police had taken notes and done nothing. Bumpy had taken action and recovered the money within 4 days. For Tony Delucci, the aftermath was devastating in ways that went beyond the loss of $3,000. His reputation was destroyed. His customers stopped coming to the social club. His collectors lost respect for him. The men who owed him money suddenly became harder to find, sensing that Tony no longer had the backing to enforce his debts. Within 2 months, Tony closed the club and left Harlem. Some people said he went back to East Harlem. Others said he left New York entirely. Nobody cared enough to confirm the details. The Harlem Community Relief Fund distributed the $3,000 to 40 families in early December. Each family received $75, enough to buy food and fuel through the worst of the winter. None of them knew about the robbery or the recovery. They simply knew that their neighbors had helped them when they needed it most, which was exactly how it was supposed to work. Bumpy Johnson never spoke publicly about the incident. He didn't need to. His actions had communicated everything necessary. He had protected the community from someone who had violated its trust. He had done it efficiently and with minimal violence. He had reinforced the rules that allowed his operation to function while maintaining the appearance of order. The charity robbery and recovery became part of Harlem folklore. A story told to illustrate how things worked in the neighborhood during that era, how unofficial justice sometimes moved faster than official justice, how certain men maintained power not just through force, but through understanding what the community would and would not tolerate, how $3,000 and one man's pride could be lost and recovered in the same night, teaching lessons that resonated far beyond the money itself.